So what happened?
She
Okay,
demanded
scene
us
secure at
$1,000
2046.
merchandise.
Okay.
Came up, I tried to verbally de-escalate.
Uh-huh.
She told me that she wanted to wreck it out, and I told her we couldn't do that.
Okay.
And then she said, excuse me, and I was like, man, like, I need you to back up or leave, like, well, we can't do that for you. So she started charging at me. I came all the way back into my office, into an enclosed space, and I hit her in the face.
Okay. Are you
And I have
okay?
it all on video.
Ma'am, are you okay?
Physically, I'm okay. Emotionally.
On October 22, 2022, in the suburban tranquility of Blue Ash, Ohio, a predominantly white, upper-middle-class community in Hamilton County, an incident unfolded inside a Target store that would capture national attention and ignite fierce debates about race, reparations, personal responsibility, and the appropriate use of force. What began as a routine grocery transaction escalated into a physical confrontation that left one woman unconscious on the floor of a security office, arrested and charged with criminal offenses. But this was no ordinary retail dispute. This was a collision of ideologies, a clash between individual conviction and institutional authority, and a stark illustration of how America's unresolved racial wounds continue to manifest in unexpected places. The woman at the center of this incident was Karen Ivery, a 37-year-old black woman who arrived at Target that autumn evening with more than $1,000 worth of groceries in her cart, and a mission she believed was righteous. The man who would ultimately strike her was Zach Cotter, a 28-year-old loss prevention officer doing his job. Between them stood a chasm of misunderstanding, fear, and the weight of America's complicated history, with race and justice. The evening began ordinarily enough. Ivory had filled her shopping cart with groceries, the mundane necessities of daily life, food, household items, the stuff of survival. But as the cashier began scanning her items, a realization crystallized. Ivory didn't have enough money to cover the bill, which was approaching $1,051. In most circumstances, this would lead to a simple resolution: removing items, using a credit card, or leaving empty-handed. But Ivory had something else in mind. According to police reports and witness statements, Ivory began speaking to the cashier in hushed tones about reparations. She wasn't asking for a discount or a payment plan. She was demanding that Target, the multi-billion-dollar retail corporation, compensate her for historical injustices, that they make reparations for slavery and systemic racism by covering her grocery bill. The cashier, likely in her late teens or early 20s and earning minimum wage, was understandably confused and overwhelmed. This wasn't covered in her training manual. She did what retail workers are taught to do when confronted with situations beyond their authority. She called for a manager. When the manager arrived, a young woman trying to navigate the complexities of retail management, she encountered Ivory's request with a mixture of confusion and an attempt at professionalism. According to the manager's statement to police, Ivory launched into what she described as a spiel about privilege, disadvantage, and the moral obligation of corporations to make amends for historical wrongs. The manager's response was measured and procedural. If Ivory wanted to discuss donations or corporate giving, she would need to call Target's Human Resources Department in the morning. This was not something that could be resolved at the checkout line at closing time. It was a reasonable response from an institutional perspective. Managers don't have the authority to give away thousands of dollars of merchandise, regardless of the moral arguments presented. But for Ivory, this response represented something far more sinister: gatekeeping. In her view, articulated clearly in the body camera footage that would later be released, she was being blocked from having a larger conversation about systemic injustice. She saw herself as standing at a checkpoint, one of many that had kept Black Americans locked out of economic opportunity for generations. What happened next would be captured on Target's surveillance cameras. Ivory began walking aggressively toward the manager, closing the distance between them. The manager backed away, her hands raised in a defensive posture, until she was pressed against the soda machines at the cafe counter. Ivory was screaming now, her voice echoing through the store, her body language increasingly confrontational. This is when Zach Cotter entered the scene. As Target's loss prevention officer, Cotter's job was to prevent theft, manage security incidents, and protect both customers and employees. At 28 years old, he had likely dealt with shoplifters, unruly customers, and various retail disturbances. But this situation was different. Cotter approached Ivory and asked her to calm down and leave the store. It was a standard de-escalation attempt, the kind security personnel are trained to execute, but Ivory, by all accounts, was beyond de-escalation. She turned her attention from the manager to Cotter, and according to multiple witness statements and video evidence, she began following him as he backed away toward his security office. The surveillance footage shows what happened next with chilling clarity. Cotter retreating, Ivory advancing. He reaches his office and attempts to close the door, a clear boundary, a final attempt to create physical separation. But Ivory forces her way into the office, continuing to scream, continuing to advance. And then, in a moment that would be replayed thousands of times on social media and news broadcasts, Cotter throws a punch. His fist connects with Ivory's face, and she crumples to the floor, her belongings scattering across the office. Cotter immediately pulls out his cell phone and calls 911. When police arrived at the scene, they encountered two very different narratives about what had just occurred. Cotter, visibly shaken, told officers he had acted in self-defense. He had been backed into an enclosed space with no exit, he explained. He had tried to close the door, but Ivory had forced her way in. He felt threatened, cornered, and he reacted. Ivory, nursing a bruised face and wounded pride, had a completely different interpretation. She hadn't been aggressive, she insisted. She had simply been trying to have a conversation, a necessary conversation about justice and reparations. She had been gate-kept, blocked from speaking to someone with real authority. And when she persisted, when she refused to be silenced, she had been met with violence. The body camera footage from the responding officers captures Ivory's state of mind with remarkable clarity. She is articulate, passionate, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of her cause. "This is my Rosa Parks moment," she tells the officers, invoking the civil rights icon who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955. It's a striking comparison, one that reveals both the depth of Ivory's conviction and the problematic nature of her actions. Rosa Parks was arrested for quietly refusing to comply with an unjust law. Ivory was arrested for aggressively confronting retail workers who had no power to address her grievances. To understand Ivory's actions, we must understand the broader context of the reparations debate in America. The question of whether the United States should provide reparations to the descendants of enslaved people has been discussed for over 150 years, dating back to the post-Civil War period when General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15 promised 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves, a promise that was quickly broken. In recent years, particularly following the 2020 murder of George Floyd and the subsequent racial reckoning, the reparations debate has intensified. Cities like Evanston, Illinois, and San Francisco, California, have established reparations programs or task forces. California created a statewide reparations task force in 2020. The conversation has moved from the margins to the mainstream. Scholars like Harvard Kennedy School professors Cornell William Brooks and Linda Bilmes have documented how the United States routinely provides reparations to various groups: farmers affected by natural disasters, victims of government testing programs, Japanese Americans interned during World War II, even Christmas tree growers whose crops fail. Yet comprehensive reparations for slavery and Jim Crow have never been enacted at the federal level. This disconnect between America's willingness to compensate some groups for historical harms and its resistance to compensating Black Americans for centuries of slavery, segregation, and discrimination is what Ivory was trying to highlight. Her method, however, was deeply flawed. Ivory's fundamental error was attempting to extract reparations at an individual level from people who had no authority to provide them. The teenage cashier earning $12 an hour had no power to forgive a $1,000 debt. The store manager, likely earning $40,000 or $50,000 annually, had no authority to give away merchandise. Even Cotter, the security officer, was simply an employee following protocols. Reparations, by their very nature, are a collective remedy for collective harm. They require governmental or institutional action, policy changes, and systemic reforms. They cannot be negotiated at a checkout counter, no matter how passionate the advocate or how just the cause. Moreover, Ivery's approach placed minimum wage workers in an impossible position. These employees, many of whom may themselves struggle financially, many of whom may be people of color facing their own economic challenges, were being asked to solve a problem that extends far beyond their pay grade or authority. They were being made to answer for centuries of injustice while simply trying to do their jobs. The most controversial aspect of this incident is undoubtedly Cotter's decision to punch Ivery. Was it justified? Was it necessary? Could it have been avoided? From a legal standpoint, the answer appears to be yes. It was justified. Ohio law, like most states, recognizes the right to self-defense when a person reasonably believes they are in imminent danger. The Blue Ash Police Department, after reviewing the surveillance footage, determined that Ivery was the aggressor and that Cotter had acted in self-defense. He was never charged with a crime. The video evidence supports this conclusion. Cotter repeatedly backed away, creating distance. He attempted to close his office door, establishing a clear boundary. Ivery breached that boundary, forcing her way into an enclosed space. At that point, Cotter had limited options. However, the optics are undeniably troubling. A white male security guard punching a black woman in the face carries historical weight. It evokes images of police brutality, of black bodies being subjected to violence by those in positions of authority. Even if legally justified, it raises questions about whether alternative de-escalation techniques could have been employed. Could Cotter have called the police earlier, before the situation reached a physical confrontation? Could he have remained in a public area of the store rather than retreating to his office? Could Target's security protocols be improved to prevent such incidents? These are legitimate questions that deserve serious consideration, but they must be balanced against the reality that Cotter was a human being who felt threatened, who had exhausted his de-escalation options, and who made a split-second decision in a high-stress situation. One of the most striking aspects of the body camera footage is the patience and professionalism displayed by the responding officers. Despite Ivery's confrontational demeanor, her refusal to provide identification initially, and her repeated challenges to their authority, the officers remained calm and attempted to engage with her arguments. They listened as she explained her philosophy about money, privilege, and systemic injustice. They acknowledged her passion and her conviction, but they also explained, repeatedly and clearly, that regardless of her intentions or the validity of her broader arguments, her actions that evening constituted criminal behavior under Ohio law. Just because your intentions were good does not make this any less illegal, one officer tells her, his tone more educational than punitive. It's a crucial point. The righteousness of a cause does not justify any and all methods of pursuing it. The officers also explained why Cotter was not being arrested for assault. He had been defending himself, they noted, after being backed into a corner with no means of escape. The law recognizes the right to self-defense, even when the person defending themselves is in a position of authority. Ivery's response to these explanations is telling. She repeatedly frames the situation in terms of gatekeeping and holding the line. She sees herself as a warrior for justice, fighting against a system designed to keep people like her out. And in the abstract, she's not entirely wrong. There are systems and structures that have historically excluded Black Americans from economic opportunity. But in this specific instance, in this Target store this evening, she wasn't fighting the system. She was fighting minimum wage workers who had no power to change anything. Ivery was initially charged with 2 crimes, menacing and disorderly conduct. Menacing under Ohio law occurs when a person knowingly causes another to believe they will cause physical harm. Disorderly conduct covers a range of behaviors that disturb the peace or create a risk of physical harm. After court proceedings, Ivery was acquitted of the menacing charge but convicted of disorderly conduct. She was sentenced to 1 day in jail, which she had already served following her arrest, and fined $100. The acquittal on the menacing charges is significant. It suggests that while the court found her behavior disorderly and disruptive, it did not find that she had intentionally threatened physical harm. This nuance is important. Ivery was not convicted of being violent, but of being disruptive. The relatively light sentence also reflects a degree of judicial understanding. The judge recognized that Ivery's actions, while illegal, stemmed from deeply held beliefs about justice and inequality. She wasn't a career criminal or a violent offender. She was a woman who had made a serious error in judgment about how to pursue social change. This incident raises profound questions about activism, authority, and the appropriate channels for seeking social change. Ivery clearly believed she was taking a principled stand, forcing a conversation that needed to be had. But her approach was fundamentally flawed for several reasons. First, she targeted individuals who had no power to address her grievances. The cashier, manager, and security officer were not policymakers, corporate executives, or elected officials. They were workers trying to get through their shifts. Second, she conflated individual action with systemic change. Reparations, if they are to be meaningful, must be comprehensive, systematic, and democratically enacted. They cannot be extracted through confrontation at retail stores. Third, she put herself and others at physical risk. By forcing a confrontation, by backing a security officer into a corner, she created a situation where violence became likely. She was fortunate that her injuries were relatively minor. The outcome could have been far worse. It's crucial to distinguish between the legitimacy of the reparations movement and the illegitimacy of Ivery's tactics. The case for reparations is grounded in historical fact and moral reasoning. Slavery was a brutal system that enriched white Americans while impoverishing black Americans. Jim Crow segregation, redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and ongoing systemic racism have compounded these inequalities across generations. The racial wealth gap in America is staggering. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median white family has nearly 8 times the wealth of the median black family. This gap is not the result of individual choices or cultural differences. It is the direct result of centuries of policy decisions that advantaged white Americans and disadvantaged black Americans. Addressing this gap will require significant policy interventions. Investments in education, housing, healthcare, and economic development in black communities. It may require direct cash payments to descendants of enslaved people. It will certainly require a national reckoning with our history and a commitment to creating a more equitable future. But this work must be done through democratic processes, through legislation and policy, through organizing and advocacy. It cannot be done through confrontations at Target stores. What can we learn from this troubling incident? Several lessons emerge. For activists and advocates, choose your battles wisely. Direct your energy toward those with the power to create change. Legislators, corporate executives, policymakers. Don't put minimum wage workers in impossible positions. For retail workers and security personnel, de-escalation training is crucial, but so is recognition that some situations cannot be de-escalated. When physical safety is at risk, protecting yourself and others must be the priority. For police, the officers in this case demonstrated admirable patience and professionalism. They listened, they explained. They treated Ivery with dignity even as they arrested her. This is the standard to which all law enforcement should be held. For society, we must find ways to have difficult conversations about race, justice, and reparations without resorting to confrontation and violence. We must create spaces for dialogue that don't put individuals in impossible positions. In many ways, that Target checkout line serves as a metaphor for America's broader struggle with racial justice. It's a place where transactions occur, where exchanges are made, where debts are settled. But it's also a place where the weight of history intrudes, where past injustices demand present accounting, where the simple act of buying groceries becomes fraught with meaning. Karen Ivery stood at that checkout line and saw an opportunity to force a conversation about reparations. She saw gatekeepers who needed to be confronted, a system that needed to be challenged. She invoked Rosa Parks, believing she was taking a principled stand against injustice. But Rosa Parks didn't assault bus drivers or force her way into offices. She simply refused to move, quietly and with dignity, knowing that her arrest would serve a larger purpose. Her action was strategic, coordinated with civil rights leaders, and designed to challenge an unjust law through the courts. Ivory's action was none of these things. It was impulsive, confrontational, and ultimately counterproductive. Rather than advancing the cause of reparations, it provided ammunition to those who opposed them. Rather than highlighting systemic injustice, it highlighted individual poor judgment. The tragedy of this incident is that it obscures legitimate grievances beneath illegitimate tactics. The conversation we should be having, about America's debt to Black Americans, about how to address centuries of injustice, about what reparations might look like, gets lost in debates about whether a security guard was justified in punching a woman who backed him into a corner. As America continues to grapple with its racial past and present, we must find better ways to have these conversations. We must create democratic processes for addressing historical harms. We must distinguish between the righteousness of a cause and the appropriateness of specific tactics. And we must remember that the checkout line at Target, like any other public space, is shared by human beings trying to navigate complex realities. The cashier, the manager, the security officer, and yes, even Karen Ivery. All of them are caught up in systems larger than themselves, trying to make sense of a history that continues to shape the present. The question is not whether America owes a debt to Black Americans. The historical record makes clear that it does. The question is how we will pay that debt, through what mechanisms, and with what commitment to justice and reconciliation. That conversation is urgent and necessary, but it cannot happen at a checkout line, and it cannot be forced through confrontation. It must happen in legislatures and courtrooms, in community meetings and ballot boxes, through the hard work of democracy. Until then, incidents like the one in Blue Ash will continue to occur. Painful collisions between individual conviction and institutional authority, between historical grievance and present-day reality, between the America we have and the America we aspire to become.